Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore ya di sini ya. Sore, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Senang sekali bisa ketemu lagi setelah kita vakum agak lama ya, Li ya. Oh iya, saya nanti akan perkenalkan. Ini di program podcast kita. Ini orang baru nih, tapi namanya Mbak Lia Wulandari. Tapi beliau dosen di UPN Veteran Jakarta, ilmu politik juga. Tapi beliau ini yang mengomandoi CCHRS. Jadi senang Mbak Lia bisa sama saya co-host untuk satu topik yang hari ini spesial banget karena kita kedatangan tamu spesial, Profesor Olle Törnquist. Professor, welcome to our podcast series.
Thank you.
So this is a special series, so part of the program of Professor Talks. So we have several series in our podcast, in our events, and one of that is the Professor Talks. So it's really a great honor for us to have you here, and we will be discussing a topic that I think it's not much discussed in Indonesian audience, in Indonesian public, but actually we can learn a lot from the Scandinavian countries on the citizenship. And of course we might relate that also with the human rights and everything, but we really like to get your insights or your views on the citizenship, the politics of citizenship in Scandinavian countries. So Professor Olle Törnquist, Pak Olle, adalah guru besar di Universitas Oslo, University of Oslo di Norwegia. Meskipun beliau berkewarganegaraan Swedish, juga di Uppsala dan di kampus-kampus besar lain di sana. Beliau ini historian atau sejarawan, tapi juga sebetulnya political scientist, jadi ilmuwan politik juga. Jadi mau bicara teori, mau bicara, dan spesialisasinya social movement, civil society, juga termasuk isu kewargaan, kemudian human rights juga. Memang tidak secara spesifik Indonesian studies, tapi lebih ke comparative. So beliau ini juga jagonya pendekatan komparatif. Jadi we're very lucky, kita beruntung sekali bisa kedatangan. Kebetulan beliau diundang oleh UPN Veteran Jakarta untuk visiting professor di kita selama jangka waktu yang tidak terlalu panjang. But anyway, Lia, would you like to start our meeting?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for attending this podcast and becoming one of our speakers. Maybe to start our podcast, maybe would you tell us more about this concept, definition, and also history about the citizenship, especially from your Scandinavian background countries? Maybe we can start from that, Professor.
Okay. We talked before we came here. We talked in terms of politics of citizenship, and I presume what politics here primarily means power, power relations related to citizenship, and citizenship. Then I think we can define it, of course, in terms of ethnicity, religion, and that sort of thing. But in the Scandinavian countries where I come from, I think we are primarily sort of related to the French tradition of defining citizenship politically, meaning we are citizens of a country, we are citizens of a how shall I call it, of a state, of a political unit, irrespective of what religion we have, irrespective of our ethnicity. So that is the basics of it in terms of definition, I presume. But then it's also the question of, this is not just a question of whether you are having a passport or, but also your rights as a citizen, and whether you are equal citizens or whether there are separations between some people who are not full citizens, and so on. And whether you have the resources, the capacity, the ability to be an active citizen, participate in it. So I think those are dimensions that we need to keep in mind when we talk about it. Now, you asked about Scandinavia as well. Well, today, present situation, Scandinavia primarily includes Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Sometimes we include Finland as well. There's a wider definition of Nordic countries, then we would have Iceland included as well. These are floating concepts, but I think basically we are consolidated nation states. And when I say nation states, that means that we have a community which is not just political, but based on, definitely not based on religion for the time being, historically to a certain extent.
For the time being.
No, for the time being, because or at present. These are floating things. We have to come back to that. But definitely not religion as a consolidated kind of nation. And I don't think of it necessarily in terms of ethnicity either. It's cultural.
Cultural.
Yeah. I think we form a kind of cultural unit. If you look at the World Values Survey, how people's values around the world,
Yes.
We belong to the most abnormal part of the world. Yes, we are not very religious. We have not much reliance on families and so on. So we are quite different, I presume, from Indonesia in that respect. However you define modernity, you would probably say we are probably the most modern people in the world, according to a conventional definition of modernity. But in terms of equality and capacity, yes, fairly high capacity, because we have had a long tradition from the late 19th, from the early 20th century, liberal and social democratic dominance in politics, which has granted more reasonably equal rights to all citizens. But there are a few buts. And now we turn to ethnicity suddenly, because, certain parts of Norway, Finland, and Sweden have ethnic minorities. We colonized the northern parts of our country in terms of there were Same population. I mean, they are reindeer holders. And there were other ethnic minorities. You can talk of them as indigenous people, if you like. And we colonized there. They dominated the areas, right, in the north. But much of their areas were colonized in the 19th century, primarily, and onwards, because of the interest in natural resources, mining, and so on, and also of taking up farming, and in the southern parts of the northern regions, forestry as well. So, and these people are minorities, and they are still. We still owe them a number of excuses for atrocities being carried out in the
past?
Yes, in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, they were derogatively treated. They were harassed and all kinds of things because of the racial ideologies at the time. deeming them to be subordinate subordinate people and not well, sometimes even accused of not being intelligent as others, and so on. You know these things. That's how the Europeans treated you people here. It's very much the same.
Is it because the ethnicity is very different with Europe, or the race is?
I mean, this has to do with the basics for turning into their areas, or for the areas where they lived, was economic interest. I mean, you know, just like any colonization.
Yeah.
But yeah, then they were different, and there was it's absolutely the same as the European ideology of
Colonization.
racism and colonial superiority and everything. And some of these problems are still there, particularly with the exploitation of raw materials and how you are going to handle this and so on and so forth. Much has been done, but there are still investigations to be carried out and excuses to be made and reconciliations to be made and so on. There are not very many people, but there are huge areas. There are other minorities as well. People coming in. The Roman population, I mean, what usually are called gypsies, but Romans, right? And there are a few others. And then, of course, there are migrants from other countries. Plus, Sweden, for instance, drew very heavily on migrant laborers in the post-war years when our industry was booming and we needed labor power from Italy, Yugoslavia, the then Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth. And and then we have all the refugees who have come in due to the crisis in the global south and the Middle East and so on.
This is only recently, right?
No, it's, well, I mean, most of, this is so complicated. We had refugees coming, for instance, came in during the 70s from Latin America in particular, because we were engaged in supporting the progressive governments, including in Chile and in Central America. So many of the political refugees there came to Sweden. That was not a major problem because these were very well-educated people and they were politically committed and so on and so forth. They came in and we supported them, and everybody agreed to the fact that, of course, they should come. Then we got to the crisis in the Balkans, and many people came from there. They were, by the way, they were also refugees, of course, after the Second World War, from the Baltic states and so on. And the Balkan states, I mean, the ex-Yugoslavia was a bit trickier because of cultural differences, and because some of them were not accommodated really in the labor market and coming in, and then found other avenues of making their money and turning to things that were not just necessarily appreciated. But I mean, the basic reasons for not integrating was labor market problems. And that has caused some segregation, because if you have lower income and all of that, you tend to be in areas with lower standards and lower levels of education and so on. And this has increased with the coming of refugees from not so much on Syria. Again, you see, this has to do a lot with whether people have the capacity to integrate in our society, because many people come from Syria, well educated and can rather quickly come into the society. It's much more difficult for people coming from North Africa, from parts of Africa, say from Somalia or something, or from Afghanistan. Language problems, education problems, and so on and so forth. And if they don't come in on in the labor market, then how do we integrate people?
Yeah.
And then there are a number of problems coming up of that. And this is, how shall I say, this is getting worse with the with the neo-nationalist feelings that have come up in Europe, partly in relation to globalization threat, and the fact that some people have lost out in that. I mean, local people, due to deindustrialization, they haven't got jobs and so on and so forth. You have that, of course, in Eastern Europe, very much so, because after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War, they were not gaining so much from the integration. Some did, but others did not, and they have then taken a kind of neo-nationalist position and are very much afraid of competition as they see as competition from migrants. So here's a big problem now that we face today. But historically, the Scandinavian countries, aside from what I've said now, has a reasonably good history of citizenship. And that, I mean, it goes back to the fact that we have had very early strong nation states. So the political definition of citizenship has been there, right? And then, to put it bluntly, we turned Protestant. We were first, of course, Roman Catholics, most of us, but then the state expropriated the church in the 16th century, right? And took away all their properties, most of the properties. And the Protestant church was therefore impoverished and very much dependent on the state. So there was a close alliance between the state and the Protestant church. And so there were no kinds of, so the church turned even part of the state, you could say, in that sense. So there was no competition between religious belonging and the state's kind of belonging, right? Now, of course, so for many years in Sweden, for instance, hundreds of years, the church took care of registration of people rather than the state. It was the church that registered people and kept track of births and deaths and children and whether they could read and write and all of that. Very good registry.
It was headed by the priest.
Yeah.
No head of state?
Now it's taken over by the state, but that's quite, historically speaking, it's quite recently. So, talk about control of people, but
Yeah.
and this has generated some, on the other hand, some kind of equal citizenship, right? We are all political citizens in these countries, and then of course you should remember two things: that Sweden and Denmark were imperial powers once upon a time. If we go back to the 15th century, and earlier, Sweden was plundering and murdering people in Europe and so on, and making wars in what is today Russia and God. It's not just a Viking story, it's much more recent. But then these empires, yes, and Denmark colonized Norway, or dominated Norway, and Sweden colonized Finland. Yeah. So Norway and Finland has a much more recent nationalist nation state
than the other
ethos. But their nationalism is much more like yours in the sense of being related to, combined with democratization and independence movement. Whereas the Danish and Swedish nationalism is much more conservative and bourgeois.
No.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But anyway, reasonably equal citizenship aside from the, and it goes back to this history of a strong nation state. But then, if we turn to the development of active equal citizenship, and then we have to consider the fact that particularly in Norway, but also in Sweden, we didn't have feudalism to the same extent as in most other countries in Europe. So that meant that we had quite a few independent, self-reliant peasants. Okay? So there was a reasonably independent sort of citizenship, not just among the state and the lords, the big landowners and the state, and the priests and so on, but also an independent citizenship. Then, in addition, of course, the majority of the people were agricultural workers and day workers and so on and so forth. But much more sort of an independent agency, if I put it that way, among the independent peasants, and that created a kind of triangular relationship between the state, combined with the church, the lords, and the peasants. So they were always sort of, for many years, sort of competing and playing out each other. So we didn't have that absolutism as in the Bonapartistic France and so on. So that was crucial. But then the next step was the growth of liberal sentiments in the mid 19th century, where you got a rise of liberal educational movements, temperance movements, and so on. And with the rise of industrialization, rather quick rise of industrialization in the late 19th century, you also had the working class, okay? And they formed their trade unions, their self-help organizations, cooperatives, all kinds of organizations, their own houses to have meetings, almost as many as churches around these countries. People's houses called. They had educational movements. They had vacation movements. They had all kinds of self-help organizations, and they rapid rise of the working class, the labor movement in broad sense. There was
And
also
the peasants joined.
yes.
No.
The peasants kept organizing mostly on their own. In cooperative, but now we are not talking about cooperative production. We are talking about cooperative marketing, this kind of things. And so, but agricultural laborers were more related to, of course, the labor movement. But in the early 20th century, it was quite clear that the self-help organization and the liberal educational movements were not enough. We had to build welfare state, more or less, state programs, state guided programs, and that, of course, the first thing was the education, common education, a unified national educational school system, which unified people. Right? That's a threat today because it's getting privatized. But yes, so then you had the education movement, then you had all these welfare state arrangements.
So it starts from the labor movement and self-help organizations?
Yes and no, because the labor movement realized that they can't handle this on their own, and it can also not be handled only in the local municipalities. They are too short, they are too small, can't be handled. In the municipalities, the early democracy was based on to a large extent on the participation of this independent peasants participating there. But when increasingly many became laborers, then they were not taken care of, couldn't be taken care of within the farming community. therefore, there had to be programs outside the framework of the local communities and the popular organizations themselves. So they all agreed by the late 20th century that it had to be through the state. That, of course, then you can have implementation on the local level and so on with local participation, but a lot of independence there for the local municipalities. But there had to be state-based programs equal for all, and that's the rise of the welfare state, and that's when people are getting more equal capacity to be equal active citizens. Now, one group was not automatically there, that were women. So women's organizations, and they demanded also reforms and came together in negotiation with the laborers and so on. But their efforts at promoting equal citizenship in terms of men and women being equal is, I would say, quite a good success story, because since then the rise of this in the late 19th century and onwards, gaining the right to vote, right to get, equality on the labor market, right for women working as household workers, to taking up jobs in families, household helpers, to right to regulation of their work hours and so on and so forth, and later on kindergartens and regulations of all kinds of things to foster equality. There's a series of reforms that have changed, that fostered equal citizenship, but also, of course, changed conditions and improved conditions for men, because I presume that I would say we benefit also from this.
Thunder.
Thunder is a thunder.
Is the thunder outside? Yeah. Okay, yes. All right. So the listeners would know that there is rain in Jakarta. Okay, so that has changed not just the relation between men and women; it has changed society, and women are now quite equal, and just. In the universities, I would say the women are doing better than the men. The girls are doing better than the men.
Even in terms of politics, right?
Yes.
We're always referring to the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, with the high numbers of representations of women.
Women are taking over in politics. I'm not saying. Don't interpret that to mean that it's a threat. I mean, I'm just saying they are gaining influence. We have an equal situation. We have women prime ministers. We have this and that, women party leaders, and of course the capacity to do that is education. It's a number of reforms to reduce the situation where they had to take care of the household and children on their own, and all of that. And coming into work life, and making careers there, and so on. So this is good, of course.
How is the process, the history of the process, whenever they like they initiate the reform the law about the equal rights with women?
How many years did it take?
Well, if you ask the women, they would say it's a very long story. But I would say that the women's movement gained particular strength. Well, during the 20th century. I mean, the late 19th century, there was the early organizing, and then in the 20th, we also have to recognize that if you go back to the farming community, when people primarily lived as farmers, women had their special responsibilities, and there were perhaps less inequality there than when when we get the industrialization and within the bourgeoisie and so on, where women are put in the houses, in the household and so on, because in the agricultural societies, women had very important roles to play. Sometimes not necessarily equal, but sometimes, very important workplaces. But then you had the early part of the industrialization and the economic rise and so on. Then inequalities increase, and then but I think the vital thing is enabling women to get out in the workplaces, to make their own careers, earn their own money, and get subsidies for that, get support for getting there, get education and all of that. I mean, without that, people can't be independent. I mean, if you don't have your own income, how can you divorce an ugly man, for instance? If you don't have assistance with the children, how can you handle this? Because the men won't take it over. So it's not just pushing the men to take care of the kids. It has been in many ways resolved by having a more expansive public sector, a welfare state to take care of the kids. So the women are working, men are also working, but women are now employed as teachers, as kindergarten people, and so on and so forth, and with regulated hours and reasonable conditions. They're working as nurses, they are doing this, they are doing that. They don't have to stay at home and be subordinated to the men to do this kind of work. They have their own independence and work outside.
So the welfare system.
Yes, that is the and of course the economic expansion that they have. And let me say for once that those reforms are not costs in any way. They are productive. They are investments. So the economic rise in Sweden is based on a number of reforms that also have promoted economic development and growth.
But in Norway, in particular, the founding of that oil, does that
The funding of
oil,
yes.
Does that also make it different from the other countries?
Yes, of course, but I don't know to what extent it makes it different from, in terms of citizenship. You could say, well, just typical. Yes, we are much similar. Our welfare systems are reasonably similar in Scandinavia and so on and so forth. And we can, aside from the Finns, who speak in quite a different language, we can, with some problems now and then, we can understand each other and talk to each other and so on and so forth. Particularly Swedes and Norwegian, but we are also very competitive. So we are competing in athletics. We are competing in various ways. So the Swedes would of course say that the Norwegians term colonizers because they colonized the ocean, bottom of the ocean, in a very sort of clever way, and managed to control the oil in previously open seas where all people could do fishing and so on. So we would say you colonized this area, and you were fortunate enough to do that. But yes, that has affected Norway tremendously, of course. But one wouldn't say that has affected gender relation in
not
particular.
Significant.
I don't think, I am not aware of that being a very important factor. It has improved economic growth, of course, in Norway because they have handled their income in a very skilled way. They have not just, bought more cars and more things like that. They have used it in a way that have promoted their industrialization and all that.
You mentioned earlier that things has slightly changed a bit recently. What did you mean?
The worry is that because of the migration of refugees and the fact that we have at the same time had growing inequalities, particularly in Sweden, but also in the other countries due to the type of economic development during the the market-driven globalization and the neoliberal economic policies that have spread around the world. So there are more inequalities, and that means that when there have been restructuring in the industry, for instance, due to globalization, not all people have benefited from that. And at the same time, you get then the influx of migrants, and if these people are not getting good employment, if they are not integrated in the labor market, and at the same time some other people are being unemployed, then there is a risk, of course, that some of them put the blame on the immigrants. And if you at the same time have a decreased spending on welfare and don't take care of people's residential areas and all of that, and don't provide enough public housing and whatnot, then you get growing inequalities there as well. And then the less well-off in Sweden may say this is because of the migrants rather than because of the neoliberal economic policies and inequalities and the market-driven globalization rather than a more, shall we say, socially responsible globalization. And since this has not been effectively countered by social democrats and progressive policies in general, they have turned more inward oriented and not put up a good alternative to this, and that has given room to neo-nationalist parties and also neo-nationalist feelings even in the social democratic movement. Very unfortunate, and this is great, but this is not just Scandinavian, of course. You see that in Europe and in the United States and Britain
spread
and
out.
so on. Yeah, it's spread out.
It's even in Asia.
But the problem is that that even in the social democratic stronghold of Scandinavia, where strong nation states and welfare states and so on, we have not been able to resist this. I mean, that has to be acknowledged, and that definitely is a problem. And I can't see any other, you can say the way to counter this is to return to a better welfare state, better united schools, better public, blah, 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 all these kinds of things. But the problem is, the basis of the problem is international. The growing inequalities in Scandinavia are due to the global neoliberalization. The unfortunate refugees who are coming and having to flee is due to problems in the south and the way we have treated the south. So it's an international problem that is not really addressed, which is important to address in order to restore the welfare state, but also to address the problems in the south by partnership with the south. And that is not handled.
Yeah,
And that's why your book is important.
Sorry?
Your book is important, that's why. Ini teman-teman Olle baru menerbitkan bukunya yang baru. Sebetulnya juga nanti akan ada diskusinya, nanti akan kita taruh di YouTube kita juga. Lia mau nanya, kalau saya ada satu pertanyaan tuh yang soal refleksi dengan Indonesia, atau Lia dulu?
Related with the refugee, the population is becoming one of the big problem too, from the Scandinavian countries and also from the Japan, even Singapore. They also have declining population. And related with the refugee, how the country treated the refugee.
Okay, so as I said, culturally and in terms of integration of people, there are problems with those who are not, we have not taken care of in terms of integrating in the labor market and socially. But at the same time, it has to be mentioned that in pure economic terms, Sweden has, for instance, has benefited from the immigration. These people are doing very good jobs in many ways, most of them, all right? And those who don't do that are mainly people who haven't got the chance to do it.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know, they come, and most of the cost for taking care of their education, their kids and whatnot, have already been taken care of by Syria or other countries. So they are very, how shall we say, they are a benefit. But culturally, combined with these problems of providing or inability of providing housing and welfare and work, then it turns into a problem. And because of that problem, many people who find this to be a risk, or tend to find it to be a risk, react against it.
Yeah. Can just shortly on the last question, because we understand that we need to wrap it up also. Just a short one, if you could just reflect the experience in Scandinavian countries to Indonesia. I mean, of course, it's not apple to apple, and somehow we lost an important period of reform, and you know this when you started in 20th century, the welfare ideas and everything. In the 60s, we just lost it in the 60s, and everything turned to be very liberal, neoliberal kind of things.
There were many similarities between Scandinavia and, for instance, Indonesia, strangely enough, in the early part of of Indonesia's independence, and because the nationalist movement in Indonesia had similar ideas to build an equal citizenship, to build a nation state which was based on equality and on education and social welfare and everything, and of course democracy. Now that was not sustained in the late 50s, right?
Yeah.
With the guided democracy and the fact that liberals and others turned to support the military, and then you get Suharto and all of that, and then the differences are increasing. But you should also remember that why it happened was also because you didn't get the kind of support after the independence and the anti-colonial liberation movements. You didn't get the same kind of support as we got in Europe when we rebuilt our societies after fascism and Nazism, and that was the regulation of the economy. That was the Marshall Aid from the United States. That was the emphasis on industrialization and all of that. We didn't provide that. We didn't share that with you in the 50s. So that is a good reason for why it didn't happen. And then there were attempts to try to return to this by people like Olof Palme and Willy Brandt and so on in the 70s, but they failed because of the strength of the capital, rising global capital, but also on the weakness then of the anti-colonial movement that come down in the South.
Yeah.
So at that time there were many similarities. There were many similarities between Nehru in India, between many of the nationalist leaders in here as well. So we share that history together, the basic ideas, the basic aims, and
but we go to other direction.
I mean, some ethos of that may be possible to resume.
So can we turn back and come back to the...
There were attempts during the global third wave of democracy, which is now petering out. This is not a happy world anymore, in the sense that the growing conservative nationalism, the growing inward-looking nationalism, not the outward-looking liberatory nationalism. And that is very scary. And of course, the Russian Empire expanding and the response from the West, which is neglecting to build alliances with the global south, but it's just looking to the European interests and the US interests. That is very scary and provides possibilities for realignment by China stepping in instead, and China is not necessarily very democratic, right? So things are really scary, I think. But let's hope that we can do something.
Oh, look at the time. Well, actually we were planning, sebetulnya kita tadi di awal cuma 15 sampai 20 menit ya ceritanya. 15 to 20 minutes, but then it continues until like 40 minutes.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. Now we're really running late. We need to rush. Thank you again. Terima kasih Pak Olle untuk bincang-bincangnya. This is actually a one semester course, and we'd like to learn more from you, but other opportunities. And we hope you'll be willing to come back and share us again some more insights and knowledge for us. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Ria. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih semuanya. Assalamualaikum. Selamat sore.